China's diplomats were once masters of negotiation. They honed their tactics over decades to face down great powers like the United States and Russia, as well as take on India in Asia. In his book The Long Game, veteran diplomat Ambassador Vijay Gokhale breaks down China's unique diplomatic style and negotiating tactics. Tactic 1. Win negotiations before they've even begun. According to Ambassador Gokhale, China's diplomats like to put themselves in the best possible position even before negotiations have begun. They do this by studying their opponents and their negotiating positions closely. Psychological tricks like negotiating on home ground are also important to Chinese diplomats. For example, China's new communist rulers in 1949 outplayed India when diplomatic ties were established for the first time between the two countries. Gokhale points out that in 1949, China's diplomats closely studied India's leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and calculated that he was desperate to recognize China in an effort to establish goodwill between the two newly independent countries. Despite the fact that India was already an established and recognized member of the international community, China demanded that India's representatives visit Beijing to discuss the establishment of diplomatic ties rather than go to Delhi. It correctly assessed that India's willingness to establish ties and send its diplomats to Beijing meant that China had leverage and the upper hand in negotiations, which it then used to extract concessions from India. New Delhi gave up its ties with Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, which had earlier ruled China before being defeated by Mao Zedong's communists. Tactic 2. Use silence. China often uses silence to hide its true intentions on issues or simply delay agreements it does not want. For example, Ambassador Gokhale points out that China used silence with India over border negotiations to its advantage. After the end of the British Raj and the installation of new independent governments in India and China, it became clear that there were differing perceptions about where the Sino-Indian border actually was. During the 1950s, India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru declared that India's borders were fixed and not open to negotiation. This was an effort to secure India's claims on the border. China's diplomats, who were still trying to understand the complexities on the border, took notice but said nothing in an effort to buy more time and study the issues. Because China chose to remain silent, India assumed that Beijing had signaled its agreement to India's claims. Through the early 1950s, China did not raise the boundary issue with India, which lulled New Delhi into a false sense of security. Only when China was ready, it broke its strategic silence and declared its own claims over the border and rejected India's claims. It used silence to buy time, study its position, improve border infrastructure, and also consolidate its grip over Tibet. In short, China used silence to its advantage. Tactic number 3. Let someone else do the fighting. China often hides behind other countries and works through them to block policies it disagrees with. This allows it to get what it wants and keep good relations with a number of countries without taking unpopular stands. Ambassador Gokhale points out that China worked through European powers to block India's bid to secure a waiver from this nuclear suppliers group in the early 2000s. India conducted a nuclear weapons test in 1998, and after a period under sanctions, it began to negotiate a civil nuclear deal with the United States. A waiver from the NSG would allow India to access nuclear technology from around the world for peaceful uses. However, China was determined to stop India's access to this vital nuclear technology, since India had not signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Despite its opposition to India, China remained quiet in public and worked through small European powers to block India from getting a waiver from the NSG. It maintained ambivalent stances in public as well to throw India off. Tactic 4. Delay even if facing defeat. Even if China knows it will eventually lose a negotiation, it would work behind the scenes to delay defeat. After frustrating opponents through delays, China then turns reasonable and agrees to compromise in exchange for concessions in other fields. In this way, China extracts benefits from countries in return for agreeing to things it would have had to concede to anyway. The result is that countries feel grateful to China for being a reasonable party in negotiations. In his book, Ambassador Gokhale points out that China tried to use this tactic against India as New Delhi was working to list Masood Azhar as a terrorist under mechanisms established by the UN Security Council. While China knew it was the only major country blocking Masood Azhar's listing at the behest of its ally Pakistan, it also didn't want to be seen as a terrorist sympathizer in the international stage. While China knew it would lose the battle to block Azhar's listing, Beijing approached India and said it would reconsider its hold on listing Masood Azhar if Delhi agreed not to list any more Pakistan-based terrorists. However, India knew that China was under tremendous pressure internationally to list Azhar as a terrorist, given the overwhelming amount of proof against him. New Delhi called Beijing's bluff and refused the request because it knew China would have to give way. China and India remain locked in a diplomatic struggle, which stretches from their disputed border to the waters of the Indo-Pacific. For New Delhi, understanding how China approaches negotiations is key to understand how to outmaneuver Beijing and secure its own interests.